Chapter 2. The Apprentice. The black ships ran northward on a following wind, and pursuit, if any there was, they left far behind them. The few small craft they sighted put about and ran for the shore, for there was now no power in this region strong enough to resist them. So it was for 2 days and nights, and throughout this time Alv was left on his own, for Ernan lay seasick in the stern, and the mastersmith was with the Equesh chieftains. Some boys his age might have been lonely, but Alv was well enough used to his own company, and content to huddle down among the cargo in its wrappings of greasy hide, think his thoughts, and stay out of sight. It was warmer there, and safer. He was in no real danger from the raiders. The Equesh treated the mastersmith with awe, and left what he named his alone. A kick and a curse were the worst he got when he was in the way, like any stray animal on the decks. They treated their own no better. But from the other boats, where there were captives, he heard cries that haunted him. The Equesh were a fell folk, vain, proud, quarrelsome, and crueler than any other of that day. What he saw of them in the days after the raid only fed and swelled the hatred he felt, and it never left him. But at last, after what seemed like an age, the bows of the chieftain's ship ground into the sand of a narrow beach between high, cold cliffs. Then all the master-smith's goods were carried ashore with great care, and stacked high above the tide line, under his watchful eye. The moment this was done, a sharp word was given, and the warriors who had carried the last cases ran to the bows and began to push them free. As they scrambled aboard on trailing cables, the oars kicked up spray, backing water among the breakers. The rowers took up a chant, and without sign or farewell, the shark-sleek warship slid out to rejoin the others standing offshore. The watchers on the beach saw the black sails slacken as one and thresh in the breeze, while the great yard arms were canted around. Then the sails were reefed, and the raiding ships swung about before the wind, gunwales dipping into the swell, and went racing out north and west towards the horizon, as if they fled the sunrise that was coming. Alv shivered. The mastersmith had given him a good cloak, and fine fur-lined boots, no doubt from among the Equesh loot. But in this dawn, he lacked the shelter of walls, or his pile of skins, however dirty, and the faint warmth of the cattle's bodies in the air. And the air in this new place did seem to carry some extra tang of cold. Beside him, he could hear Ernan grumbling through chattering teeth. Only the mastersmith, bareheaded and lightly robed, seemed not to feel the cold. He was looking up at the dark gap in the rock wall, idly caressing a bracelet on his wrist, and listening. After a moment, Alv heard the light clopping of hooves, and an instant later saw a soft lantern gleam in the dimness. A train of ponies was making its way down the path and onto the beach. The rider on the lead pony sagged sleepily, but gasped and pulled up sharply when he saw the master-smith, and jumped down with a gush of apologies. The master-smith held up a hand. "You are early, my good Ingar. It is only that we were earlier, for the barbarians were in haste to be away. But on with the loading, and so are we." Alv watched the master-smith drift away and fall into quiet conversation with Ernan, both men drawing strange, numinous patterns on the sand. He had not missed the vast relief Ingar, whoever he was, had betrayed when he was welcomed kindly. It could be a bad thing, then, to fail this strange smith, even in a small way. That was worth remembering. Ingar, as it turned out, was the master's other apprentice, a heavy-set young man about 4 years older than Alv, with dark skin, straight features, and blue eyes like Ernan's. He looked at Alv with something of his master's keenness, and nodded slowly. His speech was much like Alv's own. "You're welcome, boy. At the very least, we can use another hand in our new forge, and a less clumsy one, I'll wager, than Master Rock here." "Clumsy?" snorted a scornful voice from the darkness. It had a gruff tone to it, but its owner was obviously a little older than Alv. "If you leave your old books, and lift a finger in the forge once in a day, we might see how deft you are, Master Ingar." The speaker came strutting forward into the lamplight, and for a minute, Alv thought he was looking at a round cloth bundle with legs. Then one end of an enormous muffler was unwound, and a broad, pale face glared out ferociously. "What are you gawking at, you? Not my fault I wasn't born with ice in my veins like all you ruddy northerners. 'Cept Ernan, and he's got it with age. 3 cloaks I'm wearing, and I still crunch when I sit down. If ever I get to go on this little jaunt—" "Listen," interrupted Ingar. "Sitting down will not be your main concern for a while if you delay the master. Now come on, and you too, Alv. The ponies must be loaded at once. At least we'll have the sun soon." When it rose, it was bright, and Alv and Ingar quickly grew warm as they lugged the boxes up onto the patient beasts, who stolidly stood and cropped the few patches of dune grass within reach. But hot as it was, Rock was slow even to throw back his hood. When he did, Alv jumped and exclaimed out loud. In the sun, the boy's hair seemed to be a tousled mass of flame, a spectacular, impossible color, red. Beneath it, his square, snub-nosed face was almost pure white, but spattered all over with flecks the same uncanny shade of red. Rock stared right back at him. "And just what are you yelping at now, may I be so bold? Never seen a body so handsome as mine before?" "You'll never have seen red hair, I'll be bound," chuckled Ingar. "Never been to the Southlands, then. They all look like that down there, you know. It's the sun makes their brains boil over." "There's rubbish for you," said Rock. "He's a Southron himself, isn't he? Brown hair and green eyes. Least, I thought they were green." "No," said the master smith, who had come up behind them so quietly everybody jumped. Alv is not a southerner such as yourself, though of the same kin. He has the look of one of the old people of the north, before they joined with the brown-skinned folk who came westward across the ice. And that is a very interesting thing to be. So, now, if you please, back to your work. The young men scurried to obey.
Old people of the north, huh?
Puffed Rock, as they struggled to fix the carrying straps around an especially wide chest.
Well, kinsman, you should be right at home where we're bound. Further north than that, men don't willingly go. Except one or two, maybe.
That's enough,
snapped Ingar. Rock pursed his lips and was silent. By the time the ponies were loaded, it was full day, and the master-smith stood up from the sand and swept a foot carefully across all his drawings. Then he gestured casually to Ingar, now on foot, and the little party set off up the rocky floor of the defile. It had many windings and long, steep slopes, and Rock and Alv, following behind, had often to help and steady the beasts, and even haul them on by their stiff, scrubby manes over patches of scree that slithered away beneath their hooves. At last they emerged, some hundreds of paces from the cliff edge, and found themselves in wide, rolling country of the kind Alv had always known. But as they crossed the top of the first low hill, heading inland, it seemed to him that there was a line of blue at the horizon, too solid to be cloud, and that in places it was crested like a wave, white caps glinting against the sky, never folding, never breaking. He did not understand what he was seeing, and he was too afraid of looking foolish to ask Rock. But the sight stirred feelings in him, of the immensity of the world, and what it might contain, and of all the things he might find in it. The shadow of the Ekwesh lifted from him. He felt like singing, but didn't know how the master-smith might react. He hummed under his breath as he went, and at every rise in what seemed to be a well-trodden path, he watched eagerly for that unchanging line, to see if it might look any nearer. By and by the path led them to a road, and along this they turned, with the master-smith strolling at their head. He wore now the black robes of his guild and rank, and at his side a short, heavy sword. Ingar too was armed, and casting watchful eyes around at every bank and copse they passed. When the road cut through a wide area of woodland, he dropped back to walk beside the younger boys.
Got to be wide awake here, the pair of you. The master-smith chose this road carefully, to judge by all the maps he was drawing. But no path is safe hereabouts. Robbers and outlaws gather near a big town, for they know what roads the merchants will take.
"Are we near a big town here?" asked Alv.
"That we are, and a big one, the last in these parts. Harthaby, they call it. We'll be there by early afternoon at this rate. But we won't be staying long. We've a long way ahead. And since we won't need all the ponies for carrying, at least we won't have to walk. Ever ridden a horse?"
"No," admitted Alv. A bull, though. Once or twice. The others looked at him again. A bull, muttered Ingar, when he saw the boy was serious. Well, a horse shouldn't give you too much more trouble then. Harthaby town was large indeed, some 3 or 4 times the size of Asenby. Alv had never seen anywhere so large, too wide for a single hill. Its walls meandered out around 2 or 3, and each was crowned with a building larger than the headsman's house, larger even than Asenby's granary. When they reached the main gate, though, it was no wider than Landgate, and well guarded. There was a press of people waiting to pass. But the master-smith simply spoke a few words to the guards, and they passed his party through ahead of everyone, much to Alv's embarrassment. Nobody dared hiss or glare at so great a smith, so they reserved it for the most ragged member of his party. But he forgot that at once, the moment he was in town, for so many streets and such a throng of people were new to him, though the others said there were many greater towns to the south. The huge buildings, said Rock, were the halls of guild, where members met and markets were held. It was to one they'd be going now, though only for as long as unloading the boxes and loading up some traveling gear would take.
And getting a bite to eat, if our noble master's not in one of his fasting moods.
The Ekwesh gave me some food, Alv commented ruefully, but I never dared touch their meat. Rock shuddered.
Aye, the dirty brutes. Never know whom you'd be eating, eh?
Fortunately, there was food enough at the Merchants' Guild Hall, though others at the servants' tables complained bitterly about corn porridge and smoked fish, saying that they were no decent delicacies any more with the saying that they could get no decent delicacies any more with the corsairs terrorizing sea traffic from the south, and now also the Ekwesh. To Alv, it seemed like heaven to eat his fill, and he even out-ate Rock. The master-smith and Ingar dined with the master merchants, concluding their business over the chests brought from the ship. Watching them go, Alv wondered how much of the recovered booty came from his own town, and why Harthaby, so much richer, had not yet been attacked. But he kept that thought to himself. He was no less pleased when Ingar took him off to find a bath and some new clothes. To his surprise, they were like Ingar's own, though less decorated. Good woolen shirts, jerkin and hose of black leather, and the black boots and hooded cloak he already had. "The livery of an apprentice in our guild," said Ingar. "Our color is black. Probably," he added disdainfully, "because it hides the dirt." Alv looked down at himself doubtfully. The clothes felt almost indecently soft and clean against his damp skin. "Ernan and Rock don't wear it." Ingar raised an eyebrow. "Of course not. And count yourself lucky that you do, so young and untried. The master-smith has great confidence in you. That's obvious." Just how much, Alv only realized when they rejoined the others, and he saw the look of shock on their faces. Ernan sniffed disapprovingly. Rock whistled softly and nodded, but said nothing. Indeed, From that moment, a gulf opened between him and Alv, and in many ways, though they were to become fast friends, it never again closed. However, when they loaded the ponies with new supplies, apprentice and servant shared the work as before. When they mounted up, Rock did not spare himself a laugh at Alv's battle with the stirrups and frantic attempts to keep his balance, even by grabbing at his pony's stiff bristled mane. Nor did the girls and idlers in the street, and more than once Alv burned with the same black anger of humiliation he had thought left behind. He kept his eyes down or straight ahead, and did not look around him. He did not know how long it would be before he saw this, or any other town, again. By copying Ingar, however, he managed to learn the rudiments of keeping his seat and managing the reins, and by the time they had reached the northern gate, he already felt quite comfortable on horseback. And that was as well, for a long ride lay ahead. For the first day, they rode fast along well-made roads, and from time to time, they would pass others, single travelers on wagon, horse, or foot, or small trading parties serving outlying villages. That night, they camped in a stone enclosure with a hearth and roofed sleeping area, obviously built as a way station for travelers, but it was very old and crumbling. When they woke in the morning, it was Alv's turn to laugh at his fellows, because all but he and the mastersmith were stiff and sore with the ride and sleeping on the ground. On the second and third nights, they found other stations like it, though even more decrepit. All this time the road wound on between the low hills, unchanging, but it became more cracked and overgrown. Other travelers were few, rarely on foot, and always armed and distrustful. The station they came to late on the third night was a ruin, little better than a low wall with a fire pit. On the fourth night, after a day of driving rain, they could not find the station, so overgrown was it. At last, they settled in the shelter of a great cedar, wrapping themselves in all their blankets, skins, and oiled cloth. In the morning, they were all shivering and miserable again, except Alv and the mastersmith. "And this is the best of our journeys so far," the smith remarked, listening to coughs and curses as he led the party away on a narrow trail through the brush. From here on, the high road has not been maintained this last 100 years, and the land reclaims it. So instead, we are setting off across the Starkenfells, a good week's ride over moorland. "Is this where your house is, Master Smith?" asked Alv, looking around dubiously as they neared the top of a slope. The trees were thinning out around them, and the underbrush also. Ahead were wide patches of long grass, waving in the cool, humid wind. No, indeed. The climate is anything but healthy. It lies beyond the fells, a day or two's travel through the forests, and then another 2 into the mountains, high above the cares of this world. But I imagine you have never seen a mountain." "I've heard of them," said Alv, a little casually. The master-smith smiled faintly and stretched out a long hand northward. Alv followed his gaze as they crested the slope and gasped aloud. The wave he had seen from afar seemed to tower over him now, a vast wall of gray-green glass sparkling in the clear air, flinging its jagged white crests up into the blue infinity like spray from the rocks. For a moment, such was the power and terror of the spectacle, he almost thought to see it come sweeping down across the land. And then it seemed a greater miracle that so immense and graceful a shape could remain frozen in that instant of motion.
Master Smith?
Yes?
How did the mountains come to be? They have not always been there, surely. They look as if they had been thrust up from somewhere.
The master-smith turned in his saddle to stare at Alv. I was not mistaken, I see. There is perception in you, boy. True perception. Yes, they were thrust up, like a wave, and I believe not so long ago, in the life of the land, for the edges of the rock are sharp and little touched by the weather, and the fires under the earth burn strong there, as you will see. But all the mountains are not the same age, I think, for some are more weathered than others, and of different rock. That you will learn about in due time, boy. For a good smith must be able to find and mine his own new ore at times, to make it truly pure and truly his. You will enjoy that, I think. Indeed, Alv could hardly wait. In this alone, he would surpass that old idiot Hervar, for the graybeard had not strayed beyond the village in all the years Alv could remember, let alone gone searching for ore. Small wonder he had got himself killed, if he was so little concerned with his art. It was not a mistake Alv intended to make. Over the next few days, it was increasingly he and not Ingar who rode and talked with the master-smith, plying him with questions, and never failing to find an answer that fed the fires in his mind. He was wary of offending the senior apprentice at first, but for his part, Ingar seemed glad of the rest. Hard as it was to believe, he seemed to find his master's company a strain, and was happier joking with Rock. Ernan rode in pinch-mouthed silence, which suited the others as much as it seemed to suit him. So they journeyed across the moorland, a lonely, eerie place, in which they saw no other traveler, and the only sounds of life were thin, cool bird calls echoing through the damp air. At times, the master-smith would point out the wheeling flight of a condor, high against the clouds, and once, as they drew nearer, a cloud of huge vultures rose from something. They could not see what, but it was large, trapped and decaying in a wide, boggy patch. The taint of it seemed to cling to the wind long after they passed. It might have been that which drew the pack down upon them soon after. They were hunting beasts, large but lean after the hard winter, and they crested the hill at speed, long tails stiffened and jaws set in wide, fang-edged grins, breaking into harsh, yipping cries as they saw the travelers, Cat-like they were, carrion eaters, but just as ready to run down live prey. They were built for that. Their limbs long, their brindled bodies light, flexing and stretching as they ran. But their shoulders were massive, to carry the heavy heads whose thick jaws could sever a pony's leg at a single bite. Alv, with his herdsman's eye, counted 12 of the brutes, and no chance of running to cover in this bare land. The master-smith whirled in his saddle. Alv expected him to draw a sword, but instead he sprang down, and Ingar with him. They waved the others back. It seemed like madness, but Alv, acutely conscious of his new livery, seized a metal bar from the baggage and sprang down beside them. Ingar was calmly flicking an odd device, a flint and steel wheel with a thick loop of cord attached, till the brutes were almost on them. The cord sizzled suddenly and flamed. The master-smith snatched it and drew back his arm as if to throw. Ingar swung away, covering his eyes, and Alv copied him. But an instant too late. A cloud of dazzling, searing light blossomed over the pack, as if the sun itself had come licking through the mists. Flaming gobbets rained hissing down to lodge in their fur. Blinded, stung, or afire, their onrush became a whirling confusion of yelps and snarls, burnt hair mingling with the carnivore stench. Only one huge beast, with gray streaks in its greenish fur, rose up on its hind legs and snapped viciously at the master-smith's face. Alv, still dazzled, heard a horrible bone and meat thud, and saw the beast roll kicking at his feet. Another snarling shape loomed up before him. He struck at it and heard bones break. And as his sight cleared, he saw Ingar stoop with a tinderbox in his hand. This time he closed his eyes, but the tongue of light raced scarlet across its closed eyelids, and the pack turned and fled, yelping tails firmly between their legs. "Good," said the master-smith calmly, wiping his sword on still quivering fur. "Since nobody is hurt, let us be moving on at once, for if they regain their nerve and decide to stalk us, we shall have no peace by night." "You have seen," he added, turning to Alv as they mounted up, "a useful alliance of subtlety with force. Never forget it. They were more afraid of the fire than our swords, though it could do them less harm. So are the weak in mind led or driven, be they beast or man. The art of the true smith can be turned to great ends in this world, and often by applying its simplest skills. That flame seemed uncannily bright, did it not? Yet no magecraft at all was needed for it. Simply 2 items of knowledge. First, that a certain rare metal burns thus when very pure. Second, how to find and purify it. Simple enough, but do not scorn such trifles. For all that, when you come to master the great craft, as you will soon enough." "Master Smith." Al felt a cold tingle of excitement stir behind his belt, and an icier one of apprehension. he had to ask. Yet he was afraid. Afraid he would offend the master, show himself up as stupid or unsuitable. But the mastersmith looked at him with keen eyes and raised an eyebrow. Alv had to risk it. Mastersmith, why? Why me? What made you choose me? Why are you so confident I'll be able to do all these things? The smith considered. You feel it is a burden, that confidence. Set your mind at rest. I have reasons for it, and some I had from the moment I saw you. You mean because I look like one of the old northerners? Indeed. That in itself was enough to interest me. All the great mage-smiths have come from that stock, last survivors of the lost lands eastward, for it was among them that smithcraft was most cultivated, and so grew strongest. True smithcraft, the art that goes beyond the mere shaping of the metal, that is a rare and strange thing indeed, and not all possess it to the same degree, or at all. If a people lose sight of it, cease to cultivate it, it will fade from them. So it has for Rock's people, who became so great and so wise in things material, they felt they no longer needed it, and in time ceased to believe in it. It was some barbarian superstition they left to their less advanced cousins. In the Northlands, by contrast, it was nurtured and studied as the Southrons studied war and trade and building in stone. Yet, even in the North, it has dwindled now, as the old peoples have become assimilated among the greater number of copper-skinned folk who fled east over the ice from the rising power of the Ekwesh realm. For though they, too, knew the art, they were a plain folk, more concerned with the soil, the catch, and the seasons than any deeper knowledge. So in most of them the art has declined to that level. Wise smiths, therefore, seek their apprentices among those in whom the old stock runs strongest. Ingar, for example, with his eyes and face. Very rarely they find one of almost pure northern stock, and in them the art often runs strong. Such, I would guess, are you. But I do not need to guess about what is in you. When I look closely with the eyes of my art, I can see it, though you know nothing of it yourself as yet. And what I have seen, I trust. You will make a good smith, but how good? Only the future will show. Alv shook his head, bewildered. Thank you, Master Smith. I still don't quite... It's just that it's what I've always wanted. Naturally. That, too, is a sign. But you will see when we reach my new home. It will not be too long from the lie of the land. The beasts also, for they hunt near the forest margins at this season. And indeed, he stood in his stirrups and pointed out toward the looming bulk of the mountains, presently no more than shadows swathed in clinging mists. Alv, copying him shakily, saw a long streak of greenish-brown only a league or so distant, filling the next low hollow and spreading back over the hills to rise up among the very roots of the mountain range. The contrast of the lush carpet of treetops and the cold sterility of those slopes was amazing. It looked as if all the life had come slipping and spilling off them into the valley, leaving only their bare bones to endure the icy weather. A narrow, muddy track led the travelers in among thick underbrush surrounding cedars, ash, maples, and spruce, pines far taller than the ones Alv had known on the coast. And here and there, towering above the rest, stands of red-barked metasequoias reaching for the clouds. And this is only a sparse little outgrowth of the forests of the woods to the east, remarked the master-smith. Tapiaula Ari Aithen, the great forest that casts its shadow over the heart of all this land. Think of that. Alv shook his head. I can't, Master Smith, but I'd love to see it one day. Have you? The Master Smith's mouth twisted wryly. I have, as I hope you will, though you will need to be well proven and prepared before you venture into the realm of Tapiau. I barely escaped myself, but here that power is weak. You will learn more about it one day. Alv took the hint and stifled all his eager questions. Ingar and the servants were looking around nervously as they rode in under the shadow of the trees. But nothing more than small, green birds moved, bouncing around from bough to bough and cocking heads to eye these intruders with immense skepticism. Alv and Rock tossed crumbs to them. There were sounds deep in the forest, though. Often they heard the groaning bellows of deer, large and small, the snorting of wisents, and always in the far distance, the deep, coughing growls of meat-eaters on the hunt. Once, looking back, Alv saw a single doe slip silently across a clearing they had just passed through. When they came to a wide river, there was a swift crashing in the undergrowth as some large creature dashed away. Bright blue birds flicked up shrieking out of its path. A moment later, the travelers came across its slaughtered prey on the bank, a huge beaver, also as big as a man. A dagger tooth, muttered Ingar, twisting the tinderbox nervously. Daggertooths preyed on even the largest forest beasts. The master-smith shook his head. Look at the windpipe. Pinched shut, not punctured. Therefore, it was one of the biting, not stabbing cats. Smaller and less dangerous. In any case, not even a dagger tooth would attack a party this size. But the others kept casting anxious glances behind them as they went splashing through the ford. And that night they camped in a ring of thorn bushes, with 2 fires lit, and set a watch. From there on, however, the forest began to grow thinner as the land rose sharply. The heavy undergrowth became sparse, and many kinds of tree were no longer seen. What grew around the path now were chiefly pines, firs, and other hardier evergreens. Towards the end of the second day, the path itself grew wider and firmer. No longer a muddy track, but a well-serviced road with shaped stones set along its edges. Here and there, the resiny scent of the forest became newly sharp and strong. And looking around, Alv saw the stumps of pine trees freshly hewn, with the chips still lying around them. The light flooding into new clearings through the ravaged canopy. As the hours passed, he could see that a great quantity of wood had been taken from this forest, some very recently, and wondered who was cutting it. The master-smith, perhaps, to build his house or fire his forge. But there seemed to be almost too many stumps even for that. He could ask, but that might look stupid. Better mention it casually to Rock later. They camped that night where the trees stood tall and untouched. All throughout the next day, the trees grew thinner, the land steeper, until the forest died away to mere clumps and coverts huddled against the hillside, in one of which they camped. When they rose the next morning, the travelers found they had a clear view back over the forest and out over the lands they had crossed. Alv was startled to see how high up they were. The forest lay stretched out below him, right to the moorlands beyond, silhouetted against the dim dawn sky. He turned and blinked with surprise. He was in the mountains now, truly. They were all around him, as thickly, it seemed, as the forest had been, and the sun spilled blood down their flanks. As the travelers rode on, the last clumps of trees dwindled, and finally seemed to fail altogether. The slopes on either side were covered in coarse grass, or bushes and scrub, that clung to shelter as if in fear of being blown away. The only sounds of life were the drone of biting insects and the harsh screams of unseen birds of prey, echoing down the wind. By evening, even the smaller plants had all but vanished, and the road was leading them across a broad slope, stony and bare, between two lowering dark peaks that looked like roots put down by the sky. The wind whistled bleakly between them, and somewhere in the distance there was a sound of falling water. It reminded him of the little falls on the hill streams, but much louder and deeper. As he watched, night fell, and the weary ponies plodded on through the pale afterglow. But the master-smith gave no word to halt, and with a sudden thrill, Alv realized they must be near enough to reach the house tonight. Hours went by. Stars came out and the moon rose, and heads sagged with weariness. Ernan seemed almost asleep in his saddle, and Brock was swaying where he sat. But the master-smith was wide awake, and so, to his own surprise, was Alv, drinking in the mountain air. Darkness seemed to flavor it, like cool, bitter wine. The moon was sinking by the time they neared the top of the pass, and just as they crested the slope, it slid down behind the peaks. But instead of the sudden darkness Alv expected, a new radiance seemed to hang in the sky, paler and clearer even than the light of moon or star. The crest and the peaks stood out sharp against it, and their snow caps caught it and sparkled like frozen jewels. Abruptly, the master-smith reined in his pony and swung down. Frost crunched beneath his feet. He beckoned to Alv, who followed suit, and came trudging up to join him.
"Look, boy,"
hissed the master smith softly, with something as near passion as Alv had ever heard in his voice. "Do you see it? Do you see it there? Look at it, the glory of it, blazing back from the earth into the heavens." "I see it, Master Smith," breathed Alv, full of wonder. "Behind the mountains. It stretches as far as I can see, shining on the clouds like a reflection from a great still lake. But what is it, Master Smith?" "No lake, boy. You see in reflected glory the power that has come down to cover the Northlands, the power that ruled this world of old, that was many times dispossessed and thought defeated, and that yet holds it in its grip, and that grip is tightening. You see the great ice." The words were flung out across the mountains, their hollow echoes riding the wind like spirit voices. The glare seemed to grow more intense, and even Alv shivered in his boots. The wind sucked the warmth out of his very blood. "No," said the master smith after a moment, and his voice had dropped to a deep whisper. "You do not see it yet, not truly, but you will one day, as I did. You, when you have served as apprentice and journeyman, and become in your turn a master, you will set out alone and unattended over the ice, walking and walking on into the emptiness, enduring its hardships and braving its terrors, and the ordeal will purify you. And if you do not fail at the test, you will come at last to the heart of it, and there commune with the powers behind it. In their hands you, the master, will again become an apprentice. You will learn you will learn new knowledge, new skills, new purposes, new thoughts. Thus you yourself will be made anew, hammered, tempered, forged on the anvil of ice. On the anvil of the ice." The master smith swung round and gripped him violently by the shoulders. His eyes stared deep down into Alv's. The fierce white light blazed and rippled in their depths, and in Alv's brain a piercing point of pain awakened as if in answer. In a state halfway between terror and ecstasy, Alv felt his feet leave the ground. The mastersmith held him out at arm's length, as if he weighed nothing at all. As if released, he would flutter away on the wind. "Yes, boy," whispered the smith at long last. "There is power in you, true enough, great power. But that is not something you can take for granted. More than any other attribute, it must be developed and disciplined. It must be carefully nurtured, boy, in a climate of thought, pure thought, if petty humanity, the passions of the ape, are not to creep in and weaken it. Pure thought without taint or contamination. That is what lies out there. That is the secret behind the ice." He released Alv so suddenly the boy almost fell on the stony slope. "And that is why I came here," the smith went on in his normal, dry voice. "To be away from the stifling presence of massed humanity, the meaningless demands of the herd. Up here, where few things are living save ourselves, we may aspire to commune with the Absolute. For the moment it is checked by the mountain barrier. But not forever. No, indeed. It can afford to wait. Before ever man was, those powers set their hands upon this world, and they have never lifted it. In their service we can learn much, and achieve great art and power. Here alone is true life, and here I have made my new home." He gestured down into the valley below. "There is my home, and from now on, yours also." Alv looked down into the shadows. A little way along the valley, its wall became a sheer cliff face, down which a mountain stream fell in great cascades from the snow line high above. Just beyond it, founded on an outthrust arm of the cliff wall, rose a squat, square tower of stone from within an encircling wall. Its summit was open and flat behind high crenellations, but to one side rose a wide, round turret roofed in metal, cold-sheened in the clear, pale light. Here and there on the flanks of the tower shone squares of warm yellow and red light, and plumes of smoke or steam drifted up like banners into the icy air. Alv could only gape. He had never seen anything so large, except the halls of Guild, and they had been low and flat, not many storied like this. And it was all of stone. He had never even dreamed it was possible to build entirely of stone, and shuddered at the difficulty and danger of it. He found his voice at last, as they remounted and went riding down the steep road into the valley. "Master Smith, it's amazing. But how was it all built? Up here?" "It was built for me," said the smith dryly, with rather unusual help. "I had to pay for that, and I am still paying when I must. But it is strong, and houses all we need, including great stores of supplies. I think you will find it comfortable." After the smith's words about the ice and the meaningless demands of humanity, Alv was inclined to doubt that. But when the high gate of polished granite swung silently shut behind him, and the door of the tower creaked open, a welcome tide of light and warmth flowed out, and the aroma of baking bread. That almost reduced him to tears, for all his newfound dignity, because he remembered it from years of passing by homes that were not his, doors at which he might only beg, and never enter as his own. But here, as the master smith and Ingar went in, Ernan, Rock, and the wrinkled old woman who had opened the door all stood aside, and they ushered Alvin before them. The central hall around him was simple enough, stone-walled and flagged, strewn with rough matting. The great table and benches were of plain, solid wood, as were the seats around the fireplace that filled the far wall. But it seemed like a palace to him, and almost unbelievable that he was able to stand and warm himself by the fire undisturbed. then joined others at the table to eat bread and meat and drink mulled ale. All this was new to him, and he thought then that for all his life long he would want nothing better. And indeed, though others might have found it a lonely or uncanny place, he was happy enough to spend all the years of his growing in that house. In fashion, it was like no other house of men in Normandy at that time, being built of stone blocks after the manner of the great towns of the south, but far larger in size, and so dressed that not even the keenest edge of the winter wind could force a particle of snow or ice between them. They were bedded deep in foundations of living rock, not only for strength, but for heat. The fires under the earth burned strong and high in that place, and often the hillsides around would vent great gouts of smoke and steam, and a fearful throbbing like the breath of some great beast. At times the ground itself would tremble and heave, as if that beast stirred under the intolerable weight of the ice. But no tremor disturbed or weakened the master smith's great house, though at its very roots there opened a deep cleft in the rock, through which its hot lifeblood yet ran. The stone drew up so much heat from below that often the spray of the falls splashed into steam against the wall. The house was placed and built with a hand and a cunning past that of men, and so remained warm at all seasons in that bitter land, where living men could never otherwise have dwelt. On the stillest of summer nights, the grind and crack of stone would resound from the far side of the mountains. Under the quarterless siege of the ice, all through the half-year's winter, the frost would grip like a steel vice, and the snow-laden winds would come shrieking down off the ice, seeking the least crack or crevice to begin their ancient game of splitting the stone. But crevices there were none. Such was the work. Frost and snow alike steamed away to nothing. At the base of the tower the heat was fiercest, for there was the master smith's great forge, a wider chamber like a cave in the living rock, but with high vaultings curiously carved. When the master smith first led Alv down into it, the day after their arrival, the boy fought not to flinch at the thought of the great weight of stone overhead. But as his eyes grew used to the reddened, flickering light, he forgot his fear in wonder at the look of the place. He had grown up wondering and marveling at the village smithy. This place so far surpassed it that he was moved with a feeling almost of worship. It had something in common with Hervar's lair, the fire pit at one end and the scatter of anvils around it. But here, instead of 2 or 3, were 100 or more of all shapes and sizes, ranging from small shaping blocks on workbenches to an immense slab as high as his shoulders that seemed too huge for any mere human hand to work at. Some hero of old, such as Glaiscav, might have forged arrows here, or veyed his sword. As he peered more closely, he saw poised over it in the gloom what almost confirmed his feelings: 2 immense metal hammers with wooden hafts thicker than his thigh. "Do you wonder at them, then?" said the master smith. "Yet, once again, they are simple things. true smithcraft's servants, rather than its creation. He strode to the wall and turned a wide wheel set there a little way, and the cavern filled with the thunder of falling water. Below the wheel were rows of levers in the floor, and he pulled first one, then another. There was a long, loud creak, a slow ticking sound, and in the shadows behind the great anvil, something stirred. The fire pit casting a moving, plunging shadow on the wall. Alf had barely time to see it was a bladed wheel before the mastersmith slipped yet another lever by the high anvil. The suspended hammers jerked, rose, and came crashing down in turn on the great block of metal with a mighty clanging that shook the sandy paving of the floor, echoing in the vaults of the ceiling, and went reverberating through the boy, so that his body felt insubstantial and frail. The mastersmith shut the levers off one by one. Thus are the sternest ores crushed, and the hardest metals tempered. But before you use it, guard your ears. He stood a moment, with the faint half-smile on his face. You see there, a vent channels in a part of the waterfall to turn the wheel. That works the hammers and other such devices. Bellows, grindstones, heavy hammers, lifting tackle, metal benders, and wire drawers, all with greater power than ever came from a man's arms. And that is not all. Ingar, the older apprentice, over by the fire pit, took hold of another wheel, set this time on a thick shaft in the floor, and with immense care moved it a little way. There was a sudden, deep, coughing rumble. The flames of the pit leaped and blazed to twice their height, and spat a column of dark smoke toward the ceiling, where a wide gap swallowed it. You see, the rock itself bleeds to aid our forging. The mastersmith nodded, and Ingar hastily spun the wheel back, grinning at Alv. A forge fit for the gods, he called. All four elements ours to command, the stone around us, the wind in our air shafts, the water in the wheels, and this, he locked the shaft with a bolt. Better than having a dragon on a leash. Here we can work wonders. Rock, pouring fine sand around some impossibly delicate wax thing in a mold, laughed scornfully. We? A single glance from the mastersmith silenced him, and Ingar's angry retort died in his throat. The man smiled. Ingar is a competent craftsman, but more interested in the theory of our art. He prefers, he gestured at a low-arched doorway to the right, to bury himself in here. The door was of bronze and heavy, and when it opened, there was a sucking of air. Alv stepped through and stood blinking in the change of light, clear, cool, and coming from nowhere he could see. And when the shapes and flecks of color around the walls resolved into solidity, he was still blinded. You know what these are, then? Yes, Master Smith, of course. The town had some 3 or 4, very old. They were proud. But, am I stupid? I never knew there could be so many. From floor to ceiling, And across the center, the room was filled with books. Books of every kind, from the usual scrolls and fan-folded links to leaves of paper, parchment, or even bark tied up in clumsy sheaves or, oddly, fashioned together along one edge. "No," said the dry voice, "you are not stupid. It is an immense expanse of knowledge, more than you will find in any other library save that of Caerbrahane, which is now little regarded, or those of lost Morvan itself, and yet no more than a fraction, a grain of what there is to know. Ingar prefers to be a scholar, and makes himself useful as such, but a true master of the art, as I am, as I judge you might one day be, must balance both, the learning and the craft. I assume you cannot read?"
"A few signs I picked up. My name, a word or two."
"Well enough for you, then, because you are late to start book learning, and this is one door you must enter soon. But be warned now. Learning is not to be gulped down as you do your food. It must come in courses, by degrees, as you are ready to receive and understand it. Otherwise, it may choke you or worse. The high mysteries of our craft are not to be taken lightly, and need to be guarded. So, you may take and read any book from this south wall, or the center cases, as you will. But on the others a guard is set, surer than any lock or key, and I advise you not to cross it. For the east and west walls, you must first ask leave of me, and it will seldom be refused. But leave the north wall alone." The soft voice glittered like the ice glow. Alf shivered and nodded. "Then go now to Ingar. He will begin teaching you your letters. He has some romances and epics, which should be easy enough to begin on. Find me by my anvil in 3 hours if you weary. But you must be reading, and well, by next spring, no longer." He was reading avidly before winter. The spring season was in himself, all his pent-up energy and intelligence breaking the crust of his beginnings with the ruthless impatience of a seedling eager for light and air. And over the years that followed it, seemed to him that no winter ever came, for he felt himself grow and blossom into new strength and confidence, both of body and of mind. Little can be said of his 8 apprentice years, for little is recorded till the events which led to their uncanny ending. In manhood, he was never proud of them. Only the lesser part of his early schooling, his learning of simple smithcraft, is mentioned, and that for the changes it wrought in him. Long hours of toil at anvil, vice, and mandrel, wielding heavy hammers, swages, tongs, and hardies, hardened his body. It was labor that might have killed a thrall, but with good food and plenty, and all the force of his will, his driving need behind it, the work redoubled the strength he was born with. He grew only to middle height, but solid and well made, especially of face. It was the fine work that bowed his shoulders and narrowed his eyes. Long hours of carving out inlays in steel and tapping soft gold or silver wire into the channels. Endless vigils over tiny molds in which a minute bead of electrum shivered and slid down little by little at the vibration of a stroking finger. One minute he would be hauling bar iron, heated to the point of burning, out of the fire pit and under the mighty hammers. The next, he would be anxiously coaxing a finely enameled sword pommel out of a miniature kiln. Then, as the snows of the outside winter melted unregarded, he would be off across the mountain land with the mastersmith and rock, searching for new seams and sources of metal. In all ways they went, save only to the north flanks of the mountains, against which ground the first outthrust glaciers of the ice. Rock seemed deeply glad not to venture that way, but Alv was only the more intrigued. Sometimes, many miles to the south, the master would lead them deep into workings and mine shafts evidently made by others, and equally evidently still in use. But who the makers and users were, the mastersmith did not say, and his manner discouraged questions. There they would find many rich and precious ores for the taking, at the faces, or from heaps lying around uncollected. But though Rock was always looking nervously about, they never so much as saw the mine workers, and only once, as from an infinite distance, did Alv hear the rattle and ring of work in the stone. Often, when they returned from these expeditions, there would be horses at the gate, even a line of wagons, for the mastersmith was no hermit. Many visitors seemed to think it worth the long trek out to the house, and they were of many kinds. There were messengers, whom the mastersmith greeted with cool courtesy, but dismissed to the kitchen to await reply. There were men who came by night, hooded or masked, and stayed for no more than a word at the gate. There were pale travelers from strange lands in the south, their errands as enigmatic as their speech. Many visitors were simple merchants, come to sell supplies, or perhaps treat with the mastersmith for special work, though this he seemed to endure patiently rather than do gladly. He had no great need of more wealth. Occasionally, men in splendid clothes, with haughty airs and well-armed followers, would ride up to commission weapons and armor, or fine jewelry. But often a chieftain or merchant who took away such work would return, wealthy and beholden to mastersmith Milo, and then Alv saw their relations with him change. They would become confidants, partners, consulting a trusted advisor. When they next returned, it would be as clients to a patron, or vassals to a lord. The mastersmith would receive them with his usual mien, suave, reasonable, generous. But nevertheless, many left him pale and shaking, or bowed as under a heavy burden. Alv studied his master as assiduously as his craft or his books, and through such dealings came to see the iron in him beneath the gilt. Then, for the first time, the memory and the puzzlement of the thunderbird awoke, of the close ties with the Eqwesh, and the bargaining and bartering over the ashes of Assenby. But the years of training were also working changes in Alv's mind. His thoughts were no longer so simple, or his hatred so direct. How this was is not known, whether it was a deliberate act of his master, or whether it was a thing brought about by the boy himself. There may have been many subtle enchantments interwoven among the lone chants he was sent to learn, and that later he was taught to amend, add to, and eventually compose for himself. In these, sung into and onto their forging, lay the true magic of the smiths of old, to set a virtue in the things of their creation, to work into them powers that at their height were able to reshape the very forces of nature, or, hardest of all, to sway the minds of men. So it is possible that the will and the blame were not his own. So strong an enthrallment, though, would tend to break the spirit if it was turned on, and hamper the growth of its powers. But as the years of his learning passed, Alv's skill and craft waxed ever greater, and with it his arrogant, untamed, questing spirit. Need drove him, a desperate need to learn, to know all there was to be known. Whenever he had a spare moment, he would be delving through some volume or other, storing up masses of questions for Ingar or the Master. To break the boundaries of his reading, he mastered not only his native Northland speech, but also the tongue of Sunderney, and many no longer spoken in South or North. Even some words of Equesh he acquired. But much as he learned, it never satisfied him. In his dreams he searched out all the secrets of the world, from its heart to its heights, and shouted out his questions to the silent stars. Awake, he longed to end his apprenticeship, to become his own man, free, if he chose, to go out and explore the world. Much as he admired the master-smith, Alv had had his fill of these barren mountains, the house from which he could not stir for 6 months of every year, the few faces he was forced to see every day. Most of all, he yearned to see women again, for none had ever come there save Ernan's old wife, and she died during his 3rd winter in the house. Knowledge was his road to escape, his path to his own fortune, and he longed for it with the fervor of love. That forbidden north wall of the library drew him like a magnet, and he deeply resented the prohibition. He would run his hands lovingly over the scrolls there, fingering the smooth, dark fabric of the cylinders in their cold, carved finials, as if he could somehow divine their cloth-shrouded secrets through his fingertips. It seemed to him almost that he could, that half of the hidden knowledge came through to him, and that he lacked only a single clear glimpse to set it free in his mind. And that glimpse, that essential key, should be his by right. Always he was tempted, but he never dared risk it. Even more clearly he felt the force of the master-smith's word. And perhaps it was this hunger, the only source of feeding it he knew, that drew his mind toward what, in his innermost heart, he knew to be evil. He felt himself apart even from the others of the household, and quietly looked down on them all. Ingar he despised, even after the older apprentice had completed his prentice pieces and been made journeyman. His amiable lack of ambition and his decision to stay with the master-smith and study, rather than make a life of his own, struck Alv as cowardly and contemptible. But outwardly, he showed little of this, following the master-smith's example as in all else. Sure it is that he needed no urging to despise his origins and admire the man who had raised him out of them, and might raise him higher yet. So perhaps it is not strange that he came to feel it right and admirable to be as hard, as detached as his master, to feel joy in the domination of others, and cloak it under studied civility and friendship. Would that not seem the very stamp of a great man, a master? But he was to learn that not all of the master-smith's visitors were his servants. It was in the last winter of Alv's apprenticeship, when he might have been some 18 or 19 years of age, that the master-smith sent for him. Alv found him by the fire-pit, gazing at its low flames as if reading something from them. When Alv stood respectfully by him, he did not raise his head, but spoke briskly. "Well, boy, the world moves apace, and you with it. You are molding yourself well. I will need other helpers besides Ingar in the days soon to come. Therefore, though you are young for it yet, I judge you ripe now to try your prentice pieces." Alv lost all his studied calm. You're making me a journeyman?" "If I accept your work. If. Strictly by rule of guild, for it would be very useful to me one day if you were to hold a mastership in it. Very useful. So you must prove to me that you have some command of the higher arts of the smith. Scholarship, jewelry, armory, weaponry, such like. You will begin 3 test pieces, 2 under my direction, but the first you must manage for yourself. You will make that jewelry, I think. A simple gold arm ring, the kind wealthy young pups covet to give their girls, when they can be sure there's a good virtue of binding and fidelity laid on it. They'll sell their souls for a really fine one. Or better, their influence. Can you manage that on your own?" Alv swallowed. Yes, Master Smith." "With Mocane's treatise on the patterning of gold?" "From the east wall. Very well. You may safely take it. Mind that the ring looks good now. Graceful, nothing clumsy, but the pattern clear upon it. Now, off about your work." Alv fled willingly, half afraid he would blurt out the thoughts whirling around in his head. So, he would become a journeyman. That he had never doubted for a moment. But the master-smith was assuming he'd be willing to stay on here, free or not. Well, safer not even to think otherwise, for now.
"Why sent you to make a daft thing like that?"
asked Rock, when he found Alv shaping the fine beeswax for a casting.
"He's got no use for it, that's for sure. And no more have we, worse luck."
Alv sighed. He found Rock easier to tolerate than the others, but at times he could be tiresome. Still, it was true enough what he said. The master-smith had no use for women, or any other desire of the body. He was cold, ascetic, saving his passions only for his work and his intrigues. His household had, perforce, to live as he did, which suited the younger men not a bit. Even Ingar had been heard to complain, but not when the master was around. How would I know? Maybe he has a customer in mind.
Up here? Even the randiest ones won't come galloping over 50 leagues of road to the Northlands just for one of those.
Alv snorted impatiently. Well, maybe it's to teach me a money-making skill, then. Give me a stand to mount this on, will you? And a set of carving tools. Fine ones. And sharp. He hummed to himself as he scraped at the wax, a smooth, sweeping tune that seemed to fit the gentle curves. It had no words as yet. He would find those in the symbols he would engrave around the serpentine shape, symbols taken from that ancient book and elsewhere in his ardent studies. It was up to him to weld those words together in song, as it was to blend the symbols into a harmonious pattern. The right song, the right pattern, the right fine alloy of metals sunk cleanly into the mold, without crack or bubble. They would take the impress of their creator's power and enhance it in the form he chose. When the blank wax model was complete, he laid it down gently and turned to his books, selecting and composing, scribbling on his slates, always with that smooth shape before him. A full week that labor alone took him, in which he slept little and only remembered to eat when Rock thrust food under his nose.
Here, stick your snout in a stew pot for a change.
Alv threw down the heavy scroll with a growl of disgust and grabbed the bowl and the slice of black bread. Rock watched him with amusement.
Don't bother to thank me, will you? The stew's not that bad. The beast's only been dead a week.
Alv remembered to stay polite and mumbled an apology. Thinking too hard.
Not such a doddle as you expected, huh?
Alv gave him a withering stare. You wouldn't understand. It'll do as it is, but I've got to be sure it's perfect. You hear? Perfect.
I hear. I won't wait up then. Don't fall asleep in your stew.
Alv hardly heard him. That was the real problem. That half-felt memory that seemed so vital, that nagged him every time he stared down at the symbols scored on the slates before him. He had a pattern, a good pattern, and parts of it had cost him much labor. But some small characters had seemed to fall into place almost naturally, as if by instinct. The result looked good, but he couldn't work out why, or find any other remotely satisfying version. He distrusted that. He had followed a shadow, something cast in his mind, a shadow of the days when he was a child, before he'd come to this place. And that was ridiculous, because then he'd known no smithcraft. He swore and sent the bowl spinning across the room to crack against the high anvil. Whatever the reason, this way it would have to be. At dawn, Rock found him asleep over his slates. On them were symbols merged into a single, fluid tangle of lines, and his song had found words. He sat by himself all that day, singing softly and carving the stylized pattern deep into the wax, burnishing away trimmings and rough edges, highlighting the design here and there with stippling. Late that evening, he grafted on 2 short wax rods to act as sprue, and rousted out a yawning rock to fetch a bronze molding flask and a pail of fine white clay. Sand would be too coarse for this. By dawn, the clay was dry, and the flask set to heat at the fire pit. Rock handed him tongs wrapped in wet rags. Carefully he lifted the heavy flask, tilted it gently over an empty bowl, and spilled out the steaming wax that had once shaped those delicate curves. Only their ghosts were left now, invisible in the shell of clay. He set the flask back to heat for a moment, reached deeper into the fire, and seized a black crucible. The air shimmered violently about it as it rose, and he held it unmoving at arm's length above the flask, which Rock was steadying with tongs. Slowly, carefully, Alv tilted the crucible, and liquid spilled over and out, glowing like the sun. Alv had drawn the gold from the master-smith's deep vaults, along with tiny portions of rare metals and other substances to make it subtly stronger and easier to cast. Little by little, humming his tune, he poured the fine stream into one of the sprue holes, while Rock gently rasped a fine file over the lip of the flask to vibrate the molten metal into all the fine detail and free any air bubbles. Steam whistled out of the other sprue hole, and every second Alv's throat tightened as he feared the mold would crack. Then a little dome of gold stood out above both sprue holes and would sink no further, and they could breathe freely once more. Now there was only the gradual cooling, moving the flask closer and closer to the lip of the fire till it rested on the rim, and at last he could seize it and plunge it into the quenching bath. The icy water boiled up and splashed his hands, but after the stinging and scarring of forge work, he hardly noticed. A tap on the loose bottom of the flask freed the mold. Another cracked it. As he pulled it out, it fell apart in 2 halves, like an eggshell, and the pattern gleamed warmly up at him from the clay. He reached out to it, but another hand forestalled him. The master-smith swept up the mold, and the clay crumbled to dust under his long, hard fingers as he looked it over. Alv watched him breathlessly, wondering how he had known to appear just at the right moment. The dark eyes gleamed as they read the pattern, reflecting the gleams of gold and firelight with a strange, added luster. He gazed at it long and silently, as if seeking to unravel some puzzle. At last he nodded and handed the arm ring to Alv, still dull and encrusted with powdery clay. "I was not mistaken in you, boy. The piece is fine. It has a true power in it. More than a virtue, a power. Do you clean and burnish it now. Bring it to me tonight, and we shall consider what may be your next piece." But it was that night, as dusk was falling, that the riders arrived. It was Alv who saw them first, cantering down the steep valley floor from the north. He was sitting on the high outer window-sill of his small bedroom, as he often did, gazing on the last of the sunset and seeing it strike fire from the newly polished ring. At first he was mildly intrigued, no more. Such cloaked and hooded visitors were not uncommon. Seldom, though, on such a beautiful white mare as the first one rode. The other was a nondescript black, but both picked their way among the uneven stones with amazing sureness and grace. Then the leader reined in sharply at sight of the tower, and Alv sat up so suddenly he almost tumbled off the ledge. The dark hood was swept back, and a swath of long hair spilled out, tinged white gold by the failing sun. The voice that hailed the tower rang between the cold cliffs high and clear as a hammer stroke. Then the woman spurred her horse down the last of the slope toward the gate, and Alv hurled himself back inside and onto the spiral stair, shouting for Ingar and Rock. He went leaping down the steps 2 at a time and out into the great bare hall. Ingar came running up the steps from the library, and Rock out of the kitchen, struggling to ask excited questions with his mouth stuffed full.
"Gate!" panted Alv. "Riders! Coming! She!"
"She?" said Ingar and whistled. He turned to the kitchen and yelled, "Ernan, the gate, and be polite about it. Rock, stop your stuffing and go tell himself. He's deep in some book down there. And then go fetch my best robe. No, wait." He looked narrowly at Alv. "This woman, tall and blonde-haired, very blonde, almost white?" Alv nodded breathlessly, but Ingar's face fell. "Lohi." He shook his head. "Forget the robe, Rock. Now just what on earth could be bringing her here now?" "Old friend of yours, this Lohi?" inquired Alv archly, doing his best to look dignified again. Ingar's mouth twisted, but before he could answer, there was a clatter of feet on the library steps. They both stared in astonishment as the master-smith came running out, but as Alv had never seen him, with robes and hair awry, and a wild look in his dark eyes. He came striding over and grabbed Alv by the shoulders. "You're sure? You saw her?" "Yes, Master Smith. Clearly, and she called out, riding from the north." As if to confirm his words, came a single stroke on the great bronze bell at the gate, and the master-smith's fingers bit deeply into Alv's arms. Then he let go, with a murmur of apology, and turned away to adjust his tunic and robe, and smooth down his hair. From outside came the soft rumble of the stone gate opening, and the clatter of hooves on the polished granite. The master-smith waved the others back against the wall, squared his shoulders, strode to the hall doors, and flung them wide. The great horse halted just beyond them, gleaming in the dusk. In a flurry and rustle of fabric, its rider swung herself easily down, and tossed the reins to an apprehensive-looking Ernan. "Look to him well," she called, and stepped forward into the warm light of the hall, extending a gloved hand to the master-smith. He bowed, took it, and touched it lightly to his forehead and lips. Alv had never seen his master so deferential, but he felt no wonder in him at that. She was the loveliest woman he had ever seen. Tall and slender she stood, as tall as the master-smith, or taller, and held her head high and proud. Her pale, fine hair was gathered tight back on her head, but fell in smooth, straight cascades around her shoulders. Her high forehead and fine chiseled features were so nearly the same shade as her hair, like milky ice, that she might have seemed a beautiful statue. But for the full lips and the flash of blue eyes under heavy lids as she glanced around the room. "Well, Mylio," she murmured, and her voice had the tone of the bronze bell. "You seem to have made yourself comfortable here, and added to your household, too. Good day, Ingar. So, you are almost a man now." At his side, Alv saw Ingar bow with the practiced grace of a good upbringing. Then the blue eyes lit on him, and he wanted to imitate the bow, but dared not trust his shaky legs. "And to you also, fair apprentice. I do not know your name." She smiled, and Alv's throat went dry. There was something in the parting of the lips. "Alv, if it please you, lady," he managed, remembering the polite formulas out of some of Ingar's romances, and made a stiff but credible bow. To his surprise, she returned it with a grave inclination of her head, before turning to the master-smith. "It seems to me that you have made a promising choice, Mylio," she said, "and you shall tell me what you think of mine. For Louhi also have taken an apprentice, Kara." Another rustle, a white shape moving in the dark, halting on the threshold as uncertain as Louhi was assured. The hood was not drawn back. The thin, white cloak held protectively close. But Alv could see its wearer was also a woman, thinner and shorter than Louhi. The hood turned towards him for an instant, and he caught a glimpse of wide eyes and dark hair in its shadow. The master-smith's dark gaze seemed to penetrate it even more keenly, for he scanned her up and down and darted a glance at Louhi, running the tip of his tongue nervously over his lips. "Your judgment places mine in shadow, Louhi, as ever. May your servant ask what it is you require of him?" Louhi laughed lightly, rippling like the waterfall. "Nothing more costly than an hour of your time, Mylio, and to your own great profit. Things are moving that you should know of. Then we must ride. Come, show me the prospect from your tower, and we shall talk by ourselves." The master-smith bowed silently and waved her toward the stairs. She swept towards him with a confident stride that flared out her cloak like a train, and Alv gaped. Had he really glimpsed the hilt of a broadsword against the white skirts of her riding habit? Kara trailed after her, but the master-smith suddenly rounded on her. "By ourselves, you said, Louhi. Well then, she stays down here." Louhi's laugh rippled delicately. "Why, Mylio, how ungallant of you. Anyone would think you were afraid of the child. Well, girl, you may stay here and warm yourself by the fire as you will. But remember, we leave in an hour." The girl turned away hurriedly towards the fireplace, and the smith followed Louhi up the stairs. Ingar let out his breath with a great gusty sigh and sagged against the wall. "What's got into you?" demanded Alv in an undertone. "Thank the powers she's gone." "Why? What's wrong with her?" Ingar shuddered. "Just her presence, and those eyes of hers. I can't stand 'em. They give me the creeps. Couldn't you feel it? No? Well, there you are, I suppose. You notice Ernan and Rock have made themselves scarce." He chuckled. "Maybe she took a shine to you. If so, you may have her for me." "Listen, who is this Louhi woman anyway? Another smith?" "Keep your voice down," snapped Ingar, with a quick toss of the head toward the white-cloaked figure now bending towards the great fire. "I don't know. I've only seen her once before, the day she came to our old smithing at Sarka, far to the south, and that was when the mastersmith began making plans to move out here for good. I've heard things, though. Rumors. Whisperings. She's no smith, that's for sure. She had the mastersmith make her a sword, a fine one. A schemer, a troublemaker, a great lady out of the Southlands, probably. I've heard they let their women get out of hand down there." Alv's gaze lingered on the girl. As if in answer, she raised a slender hand and very tentatively pushed back her hood to reveal a head of short, dark hair. She turned her head slowly as if to steal a glance back at them, but caught Alv's glance and looked away hurriedly. "And the girl?" he asked nonchalantly. Ingar shrugged. "New to me, and little enough I care. If she's Louhi's, she'll be nothing for you or I, and you can take that how you like." Alv pursed his mouth. "There's no harm in just talking to her." "On your fool's head be it," muttered Ingar, and stalked off swiftly towards the library stairs. The door banged behind him, and Alv saw the girl jump, and again when he spoke. "Don't be frightened, lady. Make yourself at home here. May I find you a chair?" Now she did look at him, and Alv fought to stop himself goggling. She was the opposite of Louhi, and yet, in her own way, she too was lovely. It was her eyes he saw first, wide and strangely slanting, and as green as sea surf. High cheekbones and a firm nose made her face seem almost triangular, narrowing down to full lips and a strong chin. Her hair was roughly cropped just short enough to show her ears, neat and narrow. Her skin was creamy, browner than Louhi's, rich cream against ice. With that, and those eyes, it seemed to him a face he might have glimpsed for an instant in the forest undergrowth below. She had almost an animal aspect. A hunted animal, perhaps, already ensnared. For though her face was very young, suffering had graven it deep, and an unseen yoke seemed to weigh down her shoulders. The wildness in those eyes was desperation. Alv could not speak at first, for something welled up in him. A deep wash of feelings too fiercely foreign to the image of himself he had tried to forge. He grabbed one of the rough settles against the wall and thrust it towards her almost angrily, feeling utterly ludicrous. But she slid down onto it wearily, and a smile glimmered on her lips. Overwhelmed, he slumped down beside her. "I thank you, sir. It seems so long since I sat in peace by such a fire." Her voice was startling, deeper and softer than Louhi's. She looked at him almost amusedly. "To whom do I owe my thanks?" I'm an apprentice here. Candidate for journeyman, though. They call me Alv." He shrugged. "But you don't like that name much." Her clear sight stunned him. "I hate it. But I haven't found a better one yet. Not one I could bear without, well, feeling foolish. Like flopping around in someone else's clothes. Reach me down, rags." She nodded. Her smile was grave still, but more definitely there. "You could have no pride in that. But be patient. You'll find your name. I know you will. And earn it. There's something about you. I sense it. And so did Louhi. I heard her. You're somebody special. One alone. Out of the ordinary." "So are you. So are you." She closed her eyes a moment, and her smile tautened. "Yes, to my grief." Her head bowed, and the firelight trembled on her cheek. The white cloak fell apart. Beneath it, she wore a plain smock like any village girl's, but in dark, soft material. Her long, fine hands looked very white against it, as if they twisted in her lap. The water roared. The wheel turned. The great hammers pounded, and the fire came rushing through him. He seized her hands and held them tight against him. "Lady, I'll help you. Just tell me how, and I'll help you." She stared at him, wildly again, but did not shrink away. Her grip tightened within his own, and with strength that startled him, she caught his hands to her breast. "You can't. No smith welded my chains, and even if you were the greatest among men, you could not unmake them. Never." Then she subsided, and laughed a little, but there was no mockery in it. "But one day, perhaps, I can." I had ceased to believe that, or to see any gain in doing so. But knowing somebody wants to try, that itself heartens me so much, so very much. Anything. I'd risk anything. Her face set, and light awoke in her eyes. Light glimmering on a pool in some immense forest, far greater than any he knew. "No, I forbid you. But for not only you would suffer,
and you may have some great destiny ahead of you. I would not deny that to the world. In less than an hour, Louhi takes me from here. Let her.
And never see you again? Never know what? Tears, at least he could still dam. That much control he kept. But he knew his lip quivered like a child's. 18 years old. Candidate journeyman. He had briefly felt himself grown to a man. Now he felt empty, helpless.
I promise you this,
she said slowly, intensely,
that from now on I'll never despair. I'll watch and wait for any sane chance I have to free myself. And then I'll seek you out, wherever you are, and you'll know me. Believe me, and be content.
Flames flickered up in the hearth. A coal crackled and settled. The idea came to him in a rush. He could still face himself in his glass on the morrow. He could still risk something on a venture. He felt the fire's warmth in his smile. I'll believe you, Kara, if you'll be held to your promise. If you'll accept a token. And he held out the arm ring. She hesitated a moment, then took it, wondering, and turned it this way and that. The gold reddened in the light, and the flames danced along its pattern.
There is a virtue in this,
she said, and her voice trembled.
I, of all folk, should take care, should take long counsel before allying myself to such a thing. I should be slow to take it upon me.
Then, violently, she thrust her hand out and threw it, and it rode high on her bare arm, past the elbow, and clung there. Be you as slow to keep your promise, then, said Alv dryly, and they both doubled up with laughter, the foolish mirth that breaks the cords of fear. They swayed together, and for an instant her breath mingled with his. Their lips brushed, and then they sprang apart, for they heard light footfalls on the stair, and the rustle of Louhi's robes. Her hands gripped his an instant, and they were parted. When Louhi and the mastersmith stepped into the hall, Kara sat by the fire alone, head bowed as before. The tall woman looked around and gave a delicate, disdainful sniff. It stinks of animal in here now, after the clean air, and soot, and food, and hot metal. I long for the open road again. Come, Kara. Alv, at the open kitchen door, watched her rise and follow, saw the door thrust wide, and heard the clatter of hooves on the flagstones as if they were stamping on his heart. But he stood respectfully, and as the mastersmith ushered out Louhi and followed, Kara's arm darted out, gold bedecked from beneath her cloak to touch his.
It will aid me,
she whispered fiercely. The cloak fell back, and he saw for the first time, as if in a dream, that it was lined with innumerable minute black feathers. The hooves departed, the outer gate creaked softly too, and the mastersmith returned, rubbing his hands. He looked pale and harassed, but relieved, as if some immediate burden had been lifted. He sat by the fire in silence for an hour or so, and then called Alv to him. "Well, boy, let's be having a look at your arm ring." "My arm ring, Master Smith? Are you giving it to me?" The Master Smith looked slightly askance at him. "Yes, if you wish it, since it is your own work, though the gold is mine. But not your other pieces, mind. Well for you if you do not grow to love your own work too greatly to dispose of it to advantage." "Indeed, Master Smith," said Alv and bowed. "I have already given it away." "What? To whom?" Alv drew a breath and told him. For one instant, a blacker fury than he had ever seen crossed his master's brow. And then, surprisingly, the smith began to laugh softly. "So we have given a gift to Louhi. For what that girl has, Louhi has, be sure of that. And what precious thing did you get in return? No, save me the mawkish details. I can guess." He laughed again, a chilly little laugh, and Alv ground his teeth at what that laugh made of his hour. The smith pursed his lips. Well, the price was high indeed for any such matter, but at least there was a price. If you must trifle with women, better you learn to keep it a matter of trade than to let them assume undue importance and distract you from serious matters. He grew thoughtful. Louhi herself would know the bauble for what it was, and not wear it. But who knows? If the girl happened to keep the arm ring, it might yet benefit us greatly to have a hold over one so close to Louhi's secrets. Who knows? He clapped his hands briskly. So, to bed now. For tomorrow you begin work on your second piece, and that is armory. You will make me a helm of fine mail, and in it a virtue of concealment, of change, of moving subtly and unseen. Dream of that. But Alv dreamt of nothing. He could not sleep. His head burned on his hard pillow. Strange, twisted images of the day unreeling in his mind. 1 minute he would seethe with anger at the master smith for casually assuming he had been pawing at Kara, the way the old headman used to treat his maidservants. And then, even more at himself for not having done so. It was what he wanted, wasn't it? What caused the dull swelling ache in him now? She'd probably have enjoyed it well enough, giggled and given in the way the maidservants did, with what he'd given her for what? For the shadow of a kiss? He might have commanded the body of a great lady like Louhi, or for its worth in gold 100 street girls. He might at least have got better value for it. And then he turned over and groaned. If he could think like that, the mastersmith had made an understandable mistake, had read his character only too well. That was just what he'd thought of trying. Might have tried, if it had been any other girl than Kara. But then, why did the image of her still torment his body and banish his sleep. At last he swung himself out of his bed, tottered to the window, and flung the casement wide. The night air poured in, crisp and cold enough even at the end of winter to make his lungs blaze. He hung there, drinking in great gulps, looking at the ice glow and thinking how peaceful to be out there, cool and sterile, free from the tortures of the body. And yet, somehow, he would yearn for them still. Then, below, he heard the soft boom of the hall door shutting, and the crunch of boots on flagstones. Startled, he looked down and saw the master-smith walk out across the yard toward the main gate. It was late at night. Everyone must be asleep. Except, of course, him. Alv bit his lip. Could the smith have had second thoughts and be going after Lohi and Kara to get back the arm ring? Surely not. But a spirit of deviltry seized Alv. He'd already taken one risk and got away with it. He flung on his clothes, grabbed cloak and boots, and went padding barefoot down the worn stone stairs. Paused an instant to don his boots on the warm hearthstone in the hall, and cautiously unlatched the front door. The clatter and creak of latch and hinges sounded deafening against the silence of the night, but nobody stirred in response. The front gate was securely fastened, but he had learned the lore of locks from this one's maker, and it was fastened from the outside only. He moved through it like a ghost. The gate stirred, and then he was looking down at a trail of footprints in the deep snow. He hesitated a moment, then ran softly and lightly along their track, carefully placing his feet in the actual prints so no second track would show. At every rise or hummock, he would hunch down against cover to spy out his way ahead. And that was as well, else he would not have heard the voices in the gully beyond. He crept to the edge, peered over, and froze. The master-smith was there, but not alone. Gathered around him on the snow was a semicircle of shadows, shapeless things, but with voices low, dark, and guttural. The tallest of them was a head or so shorter than the smith, and he stood stiff and dignified above the jabbering group. Their voices rose suddenly as if in fury, but when the master-smith snapped out one or two words, no more, in a clear, commanding tone, they fell silent at once. Then the master-smith turned as if to walk away, and Alv pulled his head back sharply. If the master-smith was going back to the house, he would have to be there first. He turned and went sprinting back to the gate, and breathed easily only when it was locked behind him. Now his mind had something else to whirl over, as he padded carefully across the courtyard. What were those shadow creatures? Were they real? Alive? Or some kind of sinister snow spirit? They looked like no people he had ever heard of, and he thrilled at the master-smith's courage in dealing with them so. He crept into the hall and risked a moment at the low fire, imagining himself become a master mage whose works could call dark spirits in the night to fulfill his slightest wish, to compel any girl he desired. And was it such a wild hope? Soon he would be a journeyman, maybe a master while yet young. Then he wouldn't need to lie awake at night. Not alone, anyhow. any girl he desired. But then there would be Kara, for surely he would find her before anything, and her he would not compel. He sighed, turned away, and knocked over the settle with a resounding, echoing crash. Guiltily he scooped it up, waiting for doors to be flung open and angry shouts. Should he bolt for the stairs, or try to brazen it out? Either way would look suspicious, would very soon reach the mastersmith's ears. And what then? He would at least suspect. But there were no doors opening, no shouts, and he was almost aggrieved at the silence. Had everyone else vanished too? He peered into the kitchen. Ernan's thin snore came undisturbed from his little room beyond. Alv glided across to the storeroom and heard Rock's loud snorts. He even seemed to grumble in his sleep. Alv touched his shoulder, found no response, shook, and finally pinched him. Rock snorted more loudly, but did not awaken. Greatly daring, Alv applied the same tests to Ernan, who also did not stir. Then, afraid of the master smith's returning, he tiptoed back upstairs, and then past his room, up to Ingar's. A light burned there, but there was no answer when he knocked. He found the journeyman flat out in his bed, with a book over his face, and a lamp stinking and guttering beside him. Sleep had evidently struck him while he read, and could not be shaken off him. Alv blew out the lamp and stole away, shaken, to his own bed. The whole household lay under some spell of sleep, and he could guess why. To cloak its master's night-goings. Perhaps he did it often, and Alv had either succumbed to it, or slept naturally as he normally did. But tonight... Tonight the turmoil in his mind had kept him awake. Or had it unleashed something? Some force in him that could resist the master-smith's enchantment? Then surely he was a mage born. In the promise of that, in images of sensual delight, he found release and finally sleep. But the last vision in his mind was his first sight of Kara's face.